Hey there. Welcome to another long-distance worship service. I'm Kleber Van Zant, minister of the Unitarian Universalist congregation of Venice. If you'd like to know more about this congregation and its many opportunities for learning, growth, and connection, you can peruse our calendar and announcements on Facebook and on our webpage at uucov.org. Each month, we designate one Sunday to take up a special collection to go in its entirety to a social service or social justice organization. This January's special offering is All Faiths Food Bank. The hunger in our community has not let up since schools let out for spring break last March. The economic devastation for local working families is only just beginning, and already there is an intense and continuing need for food. All Faiths is not yet set up to start taking edible contributions again, but your check made out to UUCOV with All Faiths Food Bank in the memo line, or your online contribution through the donate button on our website is much needed and greatly appreciated. Another quick announcement: at 11 a.m. each Sunday, you are invited to attend a Zoom coffee hour where you can check in online with your friends and fellow congregants every week. Or at 11 as well on Sundays, you can join a different conversation based on topics from the weekly sermon, what you'll see in our calendars called a chalice circle. Now, please realize that you could attend the coffee hour on Sunday at 11 and then attend the Monday session of Chalice Circle at 2 p.m. on Monday afternoon. As always, it's your choice. Login information can be found for both on Facebook or on our webpage at uucov.org. We continue to try to find more ways for us to connect with each other in these odd and uncertain times. For today, for right now, we're glad you've chosen to join us. We hope you'll find something in this service that speaks to you and maybe lifts you up or challenges you in ways that lead to spiritual reflection and personal growth. Welcome to church today. The prelude begins our service. Our call to worship comes from William Ellery Channing, who is often called the father of Unitarianism. The great end in religious instruction is not to burden the memory, but to strengthen the power of thought. It's not to impose religion in the form of arbitrary rules, but to awaken the conscience and moral discernment. In a word, the great end of religious instruction is to awaken the soul and excite the spiritual life. Let us worship together. Our hymn is number 114, Forward Through the Ages, first verse only.
Forward through the ages in unbroken line, move the faithful spirit in differing measure, hearts of one accord, manifold the service, one the sure reward. Forward through the ages in unbroken line, move the faithful spirits at the call divine.
Our children have their own religious education class by Zoom each week on Sunday at 10 a.m. If you'd like to attend or to help your child attend, login information can be found on our website at uucov.org or on our Facebook page. This week, we have an animated presentation entitled, "We Are Unitarian Universalists."
We are Unitarian Universalists. We are people of many paths who are brave, curious, and compassionate thinkers and doers. Every day, people are inundated with information, overwhelmed by demands, and pulled by a culture that seeks to divide us from the web of life. Unitarian Universalism reconnects, bringing people together with meaning and inspiration. We are a house without walls, a congregation without spiritual limits, and a movement that calls you to put more faith in yourself, your community, and your beliefs. We are a faith that honors your mind, your heart, your journey. Simply put, we are a guided path towards a better you and a better world. Grounded in hundreds of years of thoughtful religious communities, we are people of many generations, ethnicities, genders and sexualities, and spiritual backgrounds. People engaged in making the world a better place. People focusing on what really matters: love, justice, integrity, and hope. Unitarian Universalists have different beliefs, but shared values. We are Unitarian Universalists, and at the same time, we may also be agnostic, Buddhist, Christian, Hindu, humanist, Jewish, Muslim, pagan, atheist, believers in God, and those who let the great mystery be. The diversity of beliefs you'll find in a Unitarian Universalist community is one of our strengths. We're always learning how to see the world from a different perspective. What unites us are our core principles that uphold 7 real-world values: believing in the worthiness of every person, showing compassion and fairness, accepting others for who they are, growing through a personal search for truth, leading with democratic spirit, working for justice, and understanding that everything is interconnected. 7 days a week, Unitarian Universalists live these principles by doing. When we gather, we worship, reflect, and remind ourselves what matters most in life. Whatever our age, we learn to live with more wisdom, more awareness, more gratitude, and more soul. We show our values by showing up to answer the call for social justice. We have a track record of standing on the side of love for civil rights, LGBTQ equality, immigration reform, environmental sustainability, reproductive justice, racial justice, and more. Find what it means to live your deepest values out loud. Join us on this extraordinary adventure of faith.
Today I brought you a column, a portion of an older column from the New York Times correspondent and columnist David Brooks. If you could go back to 1889 and strangle Adolf Hitler in his crib, would you do it? At one level, the answer is obvious. Of course you should. If there had been no Hitler, presumably the Nazi Party would have lacked the charismatic leader it needed to rise to power. Presumably there would have been no World War II, no Holocaust, no millions dead on the Eastern and Western fronts. But on the other hand, if there were no World War II, you wouldn't have had the infusion of women into the workforce. You wouldn't have had the GI Bill and the rapid expansion of higher education. You wouldn't have had the pacification of Europe, the Pax Americana, which led to decades of peace and prosperity. You wouldn't have had the end of the British and other empires. History is an infinitely complex web of causations. To erase mistakes from the past is to obliterate your world now. You can't go back and know then what you know now. You can't step in the same river twice. So it's really hard to give simple soundbite answers about past mistakes. The question, would you go back and undo your errors, is unanswerable. It's only useful to ask, what wisdom have you learned from your misjudgments that will help you going forward? So ends the reading. I invite you into a spirit of prayer and meditation as we share words of the Reverend Sarah Lawal, who is minister of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship in Boise, Idaho. Spirit of life, Spirit of love, how do we pray for hope, especially when it feels so far beyond our grasp? We breathe, we look within, we listen, we reach out. And we find that hope is the heartbeat always stirring within us. It is the imagination awakening us to possibility and the unfolding of faith in action. May we hold on to hope and carry it for one another and for this broken and hurting world. We lift up those in this community who face change, challenge, or loss today as we hold within our hearts all who suffer. And now we pray, each in our own ways, into the silence. The hopes of this community are offered forth in the names of all those who've gone before and in the names of all those who will come after, the names of all the helpers of humankind. Shalom, salam, amen, and blessed be. The interlude is Cantilena by Darwin Wolford. Our director of music, Dr. Marcel Leonard, at the piano. This past Wednesday afternoon, as I was putting the finishing touches on what might have been a wonderful sermon for this week, Linda rushed in and shoved a news feed headline under my nose that said the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. had been breached by violent protesters. In the ensuing hours, the depths of our country's brokenness played out on screens around the whole world. I stayed tuned in long enough to see our Congresspeople get back to work and restart the counting of the votes that will bring in a new administration at noon on January 20th. But it was a day of horror and fear and disgust. And as many commentators intoned, yet another day in our history that will live in infamy. January 6th, 2021. Now, I was ready to talk about other dark times we had lived through: the Holocaust, the March to Montgomery, the Trail of Tears. And I wanted to remember those dark times for a couple of reasons. First, to say that this is another of those hard times. And second, to continue to say that I believe we will get through it, even if it doesn't feel like it very often. I think the main thing I wanted to share with you, because you may not know, is how hard our recent history has been for me personally. Yeah, I know. I'm the minister, and I'm supposed to always have a smile on my face and a song in my heart. But so much has happened in so many places to so many people. And so I wrote about that in my original sermon, the one written before Wednesday's insurrection event, even using a word we've heard over and over again now on the news: unprecedented. So I'll jump to the statement I had written previously before the attack on the Capitol building. Now we find ourselves living through an unprecedented time, unprecedented at least in the postmodern era, a time of cultural anxiety and political turmoil and personal struggle. You might think we would have learned something from the 1918 so-called Spanish flu epidemic, or the Black Plague that began in 1347 and ravaged Europe intermittently for 100 years. But I guess we didn't. Alas, there really is no way to fully understand the emotional cost of quarantine and economic shutdown and long-term social distancing simply from reading a little history in a textbook. This whole thing has become more difficult than I ever imagined. 360,000 dead from COVID and counting in the U.S. alone. And what those awful numbers don't say is that we keep on getting sick, we keep on dying of other things too, even as the pandemic rages and the virus continues to mutate. Myself, I want to remain hopeful. I strive to keep an upbeat attitude. That is my job, after all. I know well that the minister who cannot be present to the people's struggle and who cannot share a word of hope in the midst of them is no minister. I know that. And still, I have to confess how hard, how very nearly impossible that task is on many of these days. Too many are lonely and out of touch with their families and friends. Too many are out of work and can't find a way through financially. Too many are desperately trying to find ways to raise their children in this odd time. And too many are sick. Too many are dying from COVID on top of all the other things we normally face. We are struggling. We are all struggling physically, mentally, and emotionally, maybe in ways we never have before. We're all anxious and on edge, maybe in ways that we never have been before. And as hard as it is some days, we have to find ways of being here for each other, probably in ways that we never have been before. And that was all written before the outrageous events of this week. Now, I knew on Wednesday that there would be a variety of responses among the American people to what we all saw vividly on our screens. What was the hardest to take for me, frankly, were the folks who claimed that all of those people wearing red ball caps and waving huge red flags were actually leftists, socialists, Antifa, disguising themselves to look like supporters of our current president. It used to be that we said you had to see it to believe it. I can't imagine what those folks saw that made them believe such complete and utter nonsense. On the whole, though, there did seem to be some small rebirth of bipartisanship on the part of the few. In debate on the Senate floor after the terrorists had been removed, Democrat Cory Booker said, "We brought this hell upon ourselves." And Republican Ben Sasse said, "In times like these, when ugliness abounds, it is imperative that we talk about beauty. You can't do big things if you hate your neighbors." I think you may know me as a steadfast stickler for the separation of church and state. So perhaps you'll forgive me if I say that I thought the central message of the night was delivered by a minister. Reverend Raphael Warnock, pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, was elected this week by the voters of Georgia as the first ever African-American senator from that state. In an interview on PBS NewsHour, Senator-elect Warnock gave what I wanted my sermon to be today. So, with your forbearance, I will quote him at length. Today's violence is what happens when you elect leaders who don't have a moral compass, who are willing to do anything to stay in power. For too long, we've had politicians who are so focused on the next election that they're not thinking about the next generation. This is a terrible moment in the life of our country. It's a dark moment, but even in the midst of that darkness, there are glimpses of light. And I'm very proud of the people of Georgia. They elected to represent them in the Senate an African American, the pastor of Dr. King's church, the first black senator from Georgia, and a young Jewish man, the son of an immigrant, a mentee of the late Congressman John Lewis, in this defining moment in our story, reminding us of the covenant that we have with one another as an American people. We've got big problems in this country. We're faced with a global pandemic, the likes of which we haven't seen in a century, and people across the country are suffering, and we're not seeing the response of our government that we need. How do you go about both dealing with the wrongs that have been done and trying to bring people together at the same time? You have a very divided United States right now. We need to be reminded that we're a nation of laws. We need to be reminded that laws have to be enforced. And there will be a time to talk about and work through all that. We have no other choice now but to work across the aisle in a bipartisan fashion. I think the words of Dr. King are particularly relevant in this moment when he said, "We will either learn to live together as sisters and brothers, or we will perish as fools." We cannot allow the covenant we have with one another as an American people to be tattered by the worst demons in our nature. In this moment, we need folks who understand that at the end of the day, all we have is one another. We've got to have these conversations around public policy, around health care, around voting rights, around a livable wage, around national security. But at root, there's a more fundamental question. One about the soul of the nation and the character of the country. And the fundamental question before America in this moment is, do we want to become a more divided nation with everyone increasingly hostile in their own silos, whether those are partisan silos or ethnic or racial or religious silos, with everyone armed and afraid of one another? Or do we want to build what Dr. King called the beloved community? In this moment, he said, we somehow have to summon the best in the American spirit and remind ourselves that at the end of the day, we're all we've got. Democrat, Republican, Independent. Red, yellow, brown, black, white. We're all we've got. This deadly pandemic has reminded us of what we should have known before the pandemic, that we need to have each other's backs. If my neighbor coughs, they might be sick and I might want to stay away. But because my neighbor coughed and I might be imperiled, that doesn't mean my neighbor is my enemy. It means that I've got to have my neighbor's back. It means that I should want them to have health care. I should want their children to have access to a quality education. I should want them to be able to work with dignity and earn a livable wage and to retire. I should want for them equal protection under the law. Reverend Warnock finished with these words. As we watched these rioters storm our Capitol and we watched the response of law enforcement, we juxtapose that with what happens when black and brown people have risen up nonviolently to give voice to their concerns. It is a marked study, in contrast, that's hard to ignore, and it calls us in this moment to build the kind of multiracial coalition of conscience that we saw this summer in response to the tragedies of George Floyd and others. When we saw Americans of all colors and all generations march out into the streets, masked up against the virus of COVID-19, in order to wage war against the virus of bigotry and racism and xenophobia. We need that kind of spirit, and we need it now more than ever, he said. Now, I hope to find some hope in all this. As David Gregory reminded us, our democracy may be delicate and vulnerable, but it's also resilient. And I want to keep an upbeat attitude, too, even in the face of the willful blindness of some of our countrymen and women. And this is hard. It so often seems nearly impossible, especially when so many are scared or lonely or struggling financially. Like I said, too many are sick. Too many are dying from COVID on top of all the other things. I don't really think this is the end of history. I think rather that it may be the beginning of something good. something like a way out of the deep hole we find ourselves in. We are all struggling, physically, mentally, emotionally, but we are together in that struggle. We are all anxious and on edge, but we are together in that anxiety. And as hard as it is some days, we have to find ways of being here for each other. Probably in ways that we've never been before. We do have each other. As Senator-elect Warnock said, that's all we have. Thank goodness for that. And thank goodness for the United States of America. So may it be. Our last hymn is number 122, Sound Over All the Waters, with lyrics by John Greenleaf Whittier. We'll sing the first and the last verses.
Sound over all waters, reach out from all lands, the chorus of voices, the clasping of hands. Rise, hope of the ages, arise like the sun. All speech flow to music, all hearts beat as one. Hark joining the chorus, the heavens resound. The old day is ending, a new day is crowned. Rise, hope for the ages, arise like the sun. All speech flow to music, all hearts beat as one.
And now a benediction from the poet T.S. Eliot. What we call a beginning is often the end. And to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Go in peace, walk softly on your paths, and may the light of love shine on you all your days.